The time is now for the Dr. Bob Sports Podcast. I am Tanner. I am our head of analytics. And for the past 7 years, I've been working alongside Bob, originating our NFL and college basketball bets. And today, as always, I'm joined by our digital media specialist, Grant. And then there were 8.
Yes, there were. They're getting cut down pretty quick here. Before you know it, we're going to have 4, and then we're going to be looking at a Super Bowl here. So, I mean, that was a fun weekend of football, but let's look at our first segment where we will be grading the script writers and how they did for Wildcard Weekend. And let's start with 2 massive performances by quarterbacks in their playoff debuts. Jordan Love averaged 1.13 EPA per play in the wildcard round, which was the most of any playoff quarterback in the last 2 decades.
Yeah, that is an insane number. So I know a lot of people aren't really, familiar with EPA per play since it's kind of a newer stat. But 1.13, I mean, that's higher than any Tom Brady playoff game ever, any Peyton Manning playoff game ever, any Patrick Mahomes playoff game ever. That's just an insane number to put up in your playoff debut. And the market is starting to believe in this Packers offense because this is the first total above 50 for the season in a 49ers game. And I think that says a little bit about the market perception of Green Bay's defense for sure, but it also just speaks to the emergence of Jordan Love.
Yeah, 100%. I saw that Luke Musgrave catch was one of the most wide open players been since 2018.
Well, and the funny thing about that play is that was leak, which is a Kyle Shanahan play. So I don't think they're going to be able to run it this week against the 49ers, but Matt LaFleur took that from Kyle Shanahan's playbook.
Yeah, that was an absolute beatdown and a good coaching job by LaFleur there. But let's look at CJ Stroud. I mean, this guy, he was incredible. He averaged 0.67 EPA per play last week against the Browns defense that conceded a league low 36.3% dropback success rate in the regular season.
Yeah, so, I mean, usually 0.67 EPA per play would be good enough for best performance of the week. And the fact that Stroud, a rookie, did that against the best pass defense in the league, another crazy performance, like you said. And he completed 3 of his 4 passes with at least 20 air yards last game, one of which was to Nico Collins, who was 7th in deep receptions in the regular season. And, Collins might have a solid matchup this week if Marlon Humphrey is out for the Ravens. I would think if Humphrey was in, they would use him to shadow Collins, but it looks like he'll likely be sidelined this week. And Humphrey ranks 5th in yards per cover snap allowed this season, is worth 1.2 points per our metric. And the other thing that I wanted to say about Collins is he had 5 receptions last week when Cleveland played man coverage. And that's kind of been the bugaboo for CJ Stroud this year. He's 4th in EPA per dropback against zone, but 26th in EPA per dropback against man this year. So if, he's kind of found a relief valve in Collins against man coverage, I think that's going to help. I don't even know if the Ravens are going to be able to play much man coverage if they don't have Marlon Humphrey, one of the best man cover cornerbacks in the NFL this week. So that could, be an improving part of Stroud's game. Now, the thing that's unsustainable for Stroud is he averaged 11 yards per pass play more under pressure last game than he did in the regular season. So that is certainly going to regress on Saturday.
Yes, it is. Well, let's switch it over to the injury watch. And we just talked about how the Ravens will likely be without Marlon Humphrey, but they could be getting back a huge piece in Mark Andrews.
Yeah, Andrews, 2nd in EPA per target this year among tight ends before being sidelined in week 11. Now, he could be back on the field for this game, and he's worth, about a point to our numbers. And they could even get into some 12 personnel because of how good Isaiah Likely, the backup tight end, has been for them. But right now, I'm currently projecting Andrews to be unavailable for this round. He logged a full practice, but I don't know that he'll be quite there to play this round, but I would expect him to play next round if the Ravens are able to move on.
Yeah, they might not need to force him in this week, but let's look at the Texans. They lost another wide receiver last week.
Yeah, it gets bleak for Houston's wide receivers behind Nico Collins with Noah Brown out, like you mentioned. I mean, Noah Brown out. They already had Tank Dell out. And so you look at it, Noah Brown and Tank Dell combined to average 2.07 yards per route run this season, while the other Texans wide receivers, not named Nico Collins, are averaging less than 1 yard per route run. So that's a pretty big difference not having Brown and Dell out there. And I think Stroud is going to be pretty reliant, at least in his wide receiver group, on Nico Collins.
All right, well, I think that ties in with our next segment here. We got the DraftKings player of the slate, and who do you have lined up for us this week?
Well, this week I've got Dalton Schultz at 4,000 400. And he only had 2 targets last week, that tied for his lowest of the season. But it was versus a Browns defense second in success rate allowed to tight ends. And now tight ends are the only skill group averaging above 0 EPA per target against the Ravens defense. So I think Stroud is going to go to Dalton Schultz, especially if the Ravens devote so many resources to Nico Collins. And, like we said, the Texans don't really have any other wide receivers to go to outside of Nico Collins. And, we think the Texans are going to be trailing quite a bit in this game, right? They're almost double-digit underdogs, so it should be a lot of passing from C.J. Stroud. Schultz averaged 6.1 targets per game in the regular season in the 14 games that he was healthy, and I think he'll get a lot of looks in this game, in this matchup, particularly to a Ravens defense that has been solid all around, but worst against tight ends this year.
I like that pick. It should be all eyes on Nico this week after what he's been doing to these defenses. But let's shift it over to our next segment. We've got stock up, stock down. And whose stock are you buying right now?
This week, I'm buying stock on throwing bombs. For any of those backyard football players, the computer game in the early 2000s, da bomb was the play. And I think Baker Mayfield is going to be throwing a ton of go routes on Sunday. So the Lions ran the 10th most man coverage in the NFL this year, and defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn could call it at an even higher rate with the secondary fully intact now that C.J. Gardner-Johnson is back. Now, Baker, his yards per attempt against man this season was only 73% of his yards per attempt against zone. That's 30th in the NFL. And so Mayfield basically solved Glenn's defense. Not really, he didn't really solve it, but his approach to Glenn's defense last time he played was throwing a league high 27% of his passes with 20+ air yards in week 6. He basically saw man coverage and was like, I'm just going to throw it deep to Mike Evans and Chris Godwin and hope they can make a contested catch. And I think he's going to be doing much of the same this week. Detroit's outside cornerbacks surrendered 9.6 yards per target in 2023. Certainly the weak point of that defense. And I think they're going to struggle against Tampa Bay's outside wide receivers.
All right. I like that. Well, whose stock are you selling this week?
So I'm selling the narrative that San Francisco is going to pound the rock. And I think this is coming in because the 49ers memorably ran for 285 yards 4 years ago on the Packers in the NFC Championship. And I think many are expecting Kyle Shanahan's offense to bully this Joe Barry's defense on the ground. However, Green Bay hired Barry as a defensive coordinator in 2021, and that season San Francisco averaged just 3.5 yards per carry in the 2 games against the Packers defense. They haven't squared off since. I think that the Packers are making it a point to never let Kyle Shanahan bully them again, and they might be devoting more resources to the ground game. And the other thing to mention is Christian McCaffrey picked up a calf strain in week 17. So, I mean, the 49ers, being huge favorites that they are here, maybe only want to give McCaffrey 15 carries in this game. Mm-hmm. So I certainly don't expect the 49ers to run for more than 200 yards like they did in that memorable playoff game. And they really could be going more towards Brock Purdy.
Yeah, and it also kind of feels like Shanahan trusts Purdy to throw the ball downfield and try to create more plays than he did with Jimmy G.
I think that's right. And particularly this week, Green Bay starting cornerback Jair Alexander is likely out. So, I could see more of a passing approach, depending on if it's going to rain in Santa Clara. I mean, you're going to have a backup cornerback, Corey Ballantyne, lined up pretty much on every snap across from either Brandon Ayuk, who leads all wide receivers in EPA per target, or Deebo Samuel, who's 8th in EPA per target this year. And the other advantage in the passing game that the 49ers have is the Packers are 29th in success rate allowed to tight ends. And George Kittle is leading all tight ends, averaging 0.66 EPA per target.
All right, well, let's shift it over to our next segment. We've got the weather of the week. Last week, weather was a huge storyline. Are we going to get another one this week?
Well, I mean, I mentioned that there might be a little bit of rain in Santa Clara, but I don't think it's going to have a huge effect on that game. The windiest game of this week is in Baltimore, which you'd think would, affect Houston more because they have an absolutely awful ground game. But I also think that the Ravens might be wanting to throw more than usual, at least take the ball out of their running backs' hands because the Texans are 6th in EPA per rush. So I think Todd Monken's going to trust Lamar Jackson a lot more in this matchup. And, if it's windy, it'll be more short passing and scrambles from Jackson.
All right, I like that. Well, let's shift it over to our primetime preview. We've got the Kansas City Chiefs at the Buffalo Bills, and these teams are very familiar with each other as they've played in the playoffs twice since 2021, and the Chiefs have won both of those. But the Bills have the upper hand in the regular season game since 2020 with a 3-1 record, and most notably that Week 14 win this year.
Yeah, and that week 14 was basically a coin flip, right? I mean, the Chiefs had that go-ahead touchdown pass to Travis Kelce, who lateraled it back to Kadarius Toney, but Kadarius Toney was offsides, and so they called the play back. And this is my favorite and most exciting primetime preview of the week because I will be in attendance. My first NFL game of this season. I usually don't get to watch because I'm trying to keep track of what's going on in the entire league on Sundays, so I don't usually go to games, but here we are, Chiefs Bills. I'm flying to Buffalo. Couldn't miss this one because it is an absolute banger.
That will be awesome. And it was just such a shame that Tony lined up offsides because that play was insane. But let's look at the Bills here. How'd their O-line hold up in that Week 14 game and for the rest of the season?
Well, I do think that the Chiefs can present problems to the Bills' O-line, which has been overall pretty strong this year. But Josh Allen was under pressure on 47% of his dropbacks against the Chiefs in Week 14 because the Chiefs can press where the Bills are weaker, right? So Buffalo's offensive line, right side of the offensive line combined to surrender 80 pressures this year, while the left side only allowed 57 pressures. So clearly worse on the right side, which is exactly where George Karlaftis and Chris Jones line up. Those two line up on the right side of the offensive line on 70% of pass rushing snaps. And Karlaftis has been great this year, breakout second year, right? 17th in pressures. And Chris Jones leads all interior defenders in pass rushing efficiency.
Yeah, and looking at the Bills here, their offense looks a little different this year with the addition of a good tight end. Is Kincaid in for a big week?
Well, yeah, that was the big kind of offseason emphasis, right? They wanted to bring in another tight end, get into 12 personnel, and Josh Allen ended up targeting tight end seventh most in the league, and Dalton Kincaid finished sixth in success rate. Now, I think the rookie and Dawson Knox will be shut down in this matchup because the Chiefs' defense is fourth in EPA per target allowed to tight ends.
You expecting any of the receivers to have a big game then?
Well, not Stephon Diggs, and we bet his reception total over last week, but Chiefs defensive coordinator Steve Spagnuolo specializes in containing opponents' top wide receivers. L'Jarius Sneed allowed more than 40 yards only once all season. So, Diggs is great with the ball in his hand, right? He's second in forced missed tackles among wide receivers, but he's not going to get the ball too much this week with Sneed pressing him so much. And it looks like Gabe Davis is likely out again with that PCL sprain. So I think Khalil Shakir might hold the keys to the Bills' passing offense. And Shakir had 29 routes. That was second most on the team last week. And his participation has increased dramatically under new offensive coordinator Joe Brady. So with Joe Brady calling the plays, Shakir's been out there on 76% of dropbacks compared to just 35% of dropbacks under original offensive coordinator Ken Dorsey.
Yeah, and I think the obvious improvement with the Bills this year is that they actually have a good run game now they can kind of lean into. So are you expecting them to really hammer that away this week?
Well, that was part of them bringing in the tight end in the offseason, right? Drafting Kincaid allows them to play more 12 personnel, allows them to be bigger, allows them to pound the rock, and they finished second in rush success rate this year. And that ground game gets even more menacing with Josh Allen involved, and he's had 35 carries in the last 3 games. So Kansas City's defense ranks 28th in EPA per rush allowed, and the Bills could implement an offense approximating that Week 15 game against Dallas when they had a 75% run play rate because the Chiefs' pass defense, they devote so many resources to stopping the pass that they kind of invite you to run, similar to Dallas, right? Dallas didn't adjust last week against the Packers. They kept playing dime against the Packers, and they kept smashing those small linebackers and safeties. And so if the Chiefs do that, the Bills might. We've seen Joe Brady be content to call so many run plays. Now, the problem with that is it takes the ball out of Josh Allen's hands, and you might not want to do that in a do-or-die game, but we've seen them do that. I mean, the Dallas game was a do-or-die game. So, I don't know. I think that the Bills will pound the rock if the Chiefs are giving them the looks that they want. Meanwhile, the Chiefs have the highest pass rate adjusted for situation in the NFL by our metrics, and we know whose number Andy Reid is going to call on Sunday night.
Yeah, and it feels like it's going to be up to Mahomes, pretty much see if he can keep carrying this team, but how is his protection going to be?
I think he'll be kept clean enough to operate in this game. I mean, so the Kansas City's offensive line in that kind of sputtering stretch when people started to question their offense ranked 22nd in pass blocking efficiency, but that was with backup rookie Wanya Morris at left tackle in weeks 13 through 18. And the Chiefs offensive line ranked 9th in pass blocking efficiency in the 12 weeks that starter Donovan Smith was at left tackle, and he'll be back on the field for this game. He played last week for the first time since week 12. And Kansas City's interior offensive line is the true strength of this unit. They allowed just 36% of the pressures this season, second fewest in the league, and they will contain a Bills interior offensive line that had 11 sacks in 7 games with Daquan Jones on the field, which is the same amount that they had in 11 games without Jones.
Yeah, 11 sacks in 7 games is great from interior guys, but they've also got Ed Oliver, who caused a lot of havoc last week.
Yeah, Ed Oliver, I mean, is even better than Daquan Jones. And when Jones is on the field, you can't devote as many resources to Oliver. He had 10 pressures last week, and 6 of them were across from Steelers center Mason Cole. We talked about that in our preview in last week's podcast, but he will not be able to do the same amount of damage across from Chiefs center Creed Humphrey, who ranks 4th in pass blocking efficiency.
Yeah, and the Chiefs kind of made it a point to target Kelsey a lot last week. Are we going to see the same thing this week?
Yeah, I mean, we were on that Kelsey over receptions prop for clients last week, but the Bills are conceding just a 51% success rate to tight ends. That's 9th in the league. They've got really solid safeties, so I don't think we'll see Kelsey as much on this game in this game.
All right, so where else is he going to be looking to move the ball here then?
Well, I normally say this would be a favorable matchup for Rashee Rice because it seemed like Bills nickelback Taron Johnson suffered his 2nd concussion of the season versus the Steelers. However, I'm projecting Johnson to suit up this week despite the short week because it's the postseason and we've basically thrown the concussion protocol out the window at this point. So everybody gets to play if they have a concussion, even guys like Matt Stafford who might have got a concussion during the game.
Mm-hmm.
And so Johnson is really good. He's a good nickelback. He's 4th in yards per cover snap allowed in the slot. So it would have been a good matchup if this was a regular season game for Rashee Rice across from backup Cam Lewis. But I think Taron Johnson is going to be in there. The other big piece for the Bills secondary is Rasul Douglas should be back on the field this week, and he was 15th in yards per cover snap allowed. And people were concerned with all the players going down for Buffalo last week. One of those guys, Christian Benford, but his absence is not a considerable loss as he's allowing 7.4 yards per target, and his backup, Dane Jackson, is allowing 6.4 yards per target. So I think a little bit too much has been made about Buffalo's losses because I think Taron Jones is going to play through the concussion. I think Rasul Douglas, not a huge downgrade. Dane Jackson, not a huge downgrade from Christian Benford. Rasul Douglas should be back. And I think Dorian Williams is not much worse than Bernard at linebacker for the Bills. So I think a little bit being too much made about Buffalo's defensive injury. Our model favors the Bills by 2.8 with a predicted total of 46.7.
All right. Well, I think that game is going to be insane. Everyone's going to be tuned into that one. But we've got our primetime prop here. And last week, you gave out DeMarcus Robinson over 41.5 receiving yards, which he got. But what do you have lined up for us this week?
Yeah, so over 41.5 receiving yards, which we gave out on the podcast on Friday, but that raised to 44.5 or 45 by game day, and it got over the Friday number, but not over the game day release numbers. So we're going with something a little bit different this week and look at the most rushing yards in the divisional round market. Grant, we'll put that up on the screen this week, and so we can go through each player here. And we talked about the reasons we don't like McCaffrey as the favorite with that calf strain and Purdy possibly throwing more than people expect. Then we see Aaron Jones. I don't think he's going to get it going on the ground because the Packers are going to be likely trailing most of this game, right? And San Francisco's rush defense ranks 7th by our metrics. James Cook and Josh Allen are going to split the rushing workload. Allen's had 35 carries in the last 3 games, so I don't think either of them will have enough yards on the ground to have the highest amount of any player this week. And then the Chiefs are not going to want to take the ball out of Patrick Mahomes' hands enough for Pacheco to have a huge game. I don't trust David Montgomery or Jahmyr Gibbs splitting the work versus a Buccaneers defense 5th in EPA per rush allowed. The Lions rush defense in that game, they rank 8th in rush success rate allowed. So I think that we're not going to see much from Rashad White. And this is the first game that the Buccaneers are an underdog of more than 4 points since week 11. So you see, how well White has been doing recently, but they haven't been a big dog like this recently. So I think his carries are going to go down. And so, that's kind of where we're looking at all the favorites. I don't like any of those guys.
Yeah, so that leaves us right here with Lamar Jackson at 12-1.
It does. And this one I think is pretty solid, right? So Jackson averaged 9.3 carries per game in the regular season, which will almost certainly go up in the playoffs. He's averaged 13.5 rushes in the postseason in his career. We talked about how the wind could force the Ravens to not be throwing downfield as much. It'll be short passes and runs from Lamar, and because the Texans are conceding just 3.3 yards per carry to running backs. So they won't be wanting to smash the running backs into this tough Texans rush defense. They'll want scrambles from Lamar or, read options where Lamar can add an extra player for the Texans to defend in the ground game. And I think Todd Monken is going to give Lamar license to scramble at any chance he can get, right? I mean, if he's not seeing his first read, it's already windy. I think Lamar's just going to take off. And Lamar has gone over 130 rushing yards in 2 of his 4 playoff games. So I like Lamar Jackson 12-1 to have the most rushing yards in the divisional round.
All right. I love that pick. I mean, that last stat, gone over 130 rushing yards in 2 of his 4 playoff games. I mean, I feel like 12-1 is good odds there, but I think that will do it for the podcast this week. We'll be back next week to talk the AFC and NFC championship games. If you're looking for more content, head over to drbobsports.com, where we've got the rest of the NFL write-ups, and also college basketball model is firing away. So if you're enjoying the content, please leave us a thumbs up, and we'll be back next week.